Philadelphia was not built in a day. It was not built in a year. It was built over decades by thousands of people whose names were never recorded, whose faces were never painted, whose stories were never told. But the buildings are still here, and if you know how to read them, they tell you everything. In 1682, a man named William Penn arrived in America with a piece of paper and an idea. The paper was a land grant from the King of England. The idea was radical for its time. Penn wanted to build a city based on tolerance, a place where people of different religions, different backgrounds, different beliefs could live side by side without killing each other. He called it the City of Brotherly Love, Philadelphia. And unlike every other city being built in the colonies at that time, Philadelphia was planned before the first brick was laid. Penn sat down with his surveyor, a man named Thomas Home, and they drew a grid. Streets running east to west, streets running north to south, clean, organized, logical. No winding medieval paths like London, no chaos like Boston. A grid. That grid still exists today. You can still walk it. You can still feel Penn's hand in it every time you turn a corner in downtown Philadelphia. It was the first planned city in American history, and it started on paper. Before anything could be built, the land had to be cleared. And this is where the work truly began. The land between the Delaware River and the Schuylkill River was mostly forest, dense, ancient forest. Oak trees so wide that 3 men holding hands could barely reach around them. Elm trees tall enough to block the sky. Every single one of those trees had to come down, by hand. The workers used axes, heavy iron axes with wooden handles that splintered in the cold and blistered in the heat. They worked in teams, 1 man swinging, 1 man resting, 1 man sharpening the blade on a stone. A good team could fell maybe 5 large trees in a day. Philadelphia needed thousands of trees cleared before the first building could even begin. The wood from those trees was not wasted. It was used immediately for temporary shelters, for scaffolding, for the first rough frames of the first buildings. Nothing was thrown away. Everything cost too much. Philadelphia is a brick city. Walk through the old neighborhoods today and all you see is brick. Red, warm, handmade brick, stacked perfectly, mortared carefully, standing after 300 years. But where did all that brick come from? From the ground, specifically from the clay along the banks of the Delaware River. The clay there was exceptional, dense, consistent. It held its shape when pressed and hardened beautifully in fire. Workers, enslaved men and women, indentured servants, and poor immigrants fresh off boats would dig the clay from the riverbank with wooden shovels and iron spades. They carried it in buckets and wheelbarrows to the brick yards. There they would mix the clay with water and straw. The straw was critical. Without it, the bricks would crack when they dried. The straw held the clay together during the drying process, then burned away in the kiln, leaving tiny channels inside the brick that actually made it stronger. This was not a discovery made in Philadelphia. It was ancient technology. The same technique used in Egypt, the same technique used in Mesopotamia. Thousands of years of human knowledge, carried in the hands of workers who couldn't read and weren't allowed to own property. Once the clay mixture was ready, it was pressed into wooden molds. Each mold made 1 brick. Each brick had to be pressed by hand, both thumbs pushing down into the corners to make sure the clay filled every edge of the mold completely. Then the molds were set out in rows to dry in the sun for several days. Then they were stacked into kilns, massive outdoor ovens made of already fired bricks, and burned for up to 3 days at temperatures that could melt iron. 1 good worker could produce 500 bricks in a single day. A single house needed between 30,000 and 50,000 bricks. Independence Hall needed over 200,000 bricks. 200,000 individual moments of someone pressing clay into a mold. 200,000 moments that history forgot. Bricks alone do not make a wall. You need mortar, the material that holds each brick to the next. Philadelphia's mortar was made from 3 things: lime, sand, water. The lime came from burning oyster shells collected from the Delaware River and the surrounding coastline. Workers would gather thousands of shells, pile them into enormous outdoor kilns, and burn them for days until they crumbled into a fine white powder. That powder was mixed with sand and water into a thick paste. It was heavy. It smelled sharp and chemical. It burned the skin if it stayed on too long. Workers mixed it with their bare hands every single day. With bricks ready and mortar mixed, the walls could begin to rise. But walls are nothing without a frame. Philadelphia's buildings were built using a method called timber framing. Master carpenters, most of them German or Swedish immigrants who had learned the trade in Europe, would cut massive beams of oak and chestnut, then join them together using a system of interlocking notches and wooden pegs. No nails. Not because nails didn't exist, they did. But nails were expensive, and wood joints done correctly were actually stronger. These carpenters were artists. They could look at a raw log and see the beam inside it. They could cut a joint so precise that two pieces of wood pressed together felt like a single piece. Some of those joints are still holding weight today. The frames were assembled on the ground first, then raised by teams of workers pulling on ropes. Raising day was a community event. Every available man came to help, because a timber frame was too heavy for any small crew to lift alone. They would count together, pull together, sweat together. And when the frame rose into the sky and locked into place, they cheered, not because it was romantic, because it meant nobody had been crushed. Once the frame was up and the brick walls were rising, the roof had to be built. And the roof was perhaps the most dangerous part of all. Workers climbed wooden scaffolding, rough planks tied together with rope, carrying heavy bundles of materials on their backs. There were no harnesses, no safety nets, no helmets. If a plank broke, and planks broke, you fell. If you fell from the second story, you might survive with broken bones. If you fell from the third story or the roof, you almost certainly did not. Philadelphia's construction records are full of gaps, blank spaces where names should be. Days when work simply stopped and then resumed without explanation. Those gaps are people, workers whose falls were recorded not with grief, but with inconvenience, a delay in the schedule, a note to find another man for the job. Their names are gone, but the roofs they built are still keeping out the rain. Inside the buildings, a different kind of work was happening. Plasterers followed the bricklayers, covering the rough interior walls with smooth white plaster made from the same lime used in the mortar. They worked in 3 layers. The first coat was rough and thick, pushed deep into the gaps between the bricks to create a solid base. The second coat was smoother, leveling out the surface and preparing it for the finish. The third coat was almost paper thin, applied with long, fluid strokes and polished with a flat wooden tool until it was perfectly smooth and brilliant white. A master plasterer could make a wall look like it was made of marble. It took years to learn. It took enormous physical strength. Plaster is heavy, and the work is done with arms raised above the head for hours at a time. And when it was done perfectly, nobody noticed. That was the point. The plaster was supposed to disappear. The room was supposed to feel inevitable, as if it had always existed exactly this way. The floors told a different story. In wealthy homes and public buildings, the floors were made from wide planks of white oak or yellow pine, hand-cut at local sawmills and delivered by horse-drawn wagon. Each plank was hand-planed until perfectly smooth, a process that took enormous skill and left the wood with a warmth and character that no machine has ever been able to replicate. The planks were laid tight together and pegged to the floor joists below with wooden pegs driven in at angles, a technique called blind nailing that left no visible fasteners on the surface. In poorer homes, the floors were simply packed earth, swept clean every morning, covered with straw in the winter for warmth, replaced when they became too uneven or muddy. The difference between a plank floor and an earth floor was the difference between two worlds. Both worlds existed on the same streets. Then came the windows. Glass in the 1700s was not like glass today. It was hand-blown by craftsmen who had spent their entire lives learning a single skill. A glass blower would gather molten glass on the end of a long iron pipe, blow it into a cylinder, cut it open, flatten it, and cool it slowly to prevent cracking. Each pane was small, rarely more than 8 inches wide, because larger panes were almost impossible to make without floors. The windows of colonial Philadelphia were made from dozens of these small panes, held together in wooden frames, divided by thin strips of wood called muntins. They let in light, but they also let in cold. The glass was thin, the frames warped. In winter, Frost formed on the inside of the glass and ice crept in around the edges. People hung heavy curtains and pushed furniture close to the fireplace, and still they were cold. Every winter, without fail, the fireplaces were the heart of every building. Every room had one, not for decoration, for survival. There was no other way to heat a building. No furnace, no radiator, no central system of any kind. The fireplace was built first, before the walls around it, before the floor beside it. The chimney rose through the center of the building or along the exterior wall, carrying smoke up and out and keeping the fire burning clean. The bricklayers who built chimneys were specialists. The mortar between the chimney bricks had to withstand temperatures that would destroy ordinary mortar. They used a special mix, richer in lime, mixed with crushed pottery. That could handle the heat without cracking. A poorly built chimney didn't just fail, it caught the house on fire. And fire in 1700s Philadelphia was catastrophic. There were no fire hydrants, no fire trucks, no organized response. When a house caught fire, neighbors formed bucket lines from the nearest well and passed water hand to hand until the fire was out, or until there was nothing left to save. Benjamin Franklin watched this happen one too many times, so he organized the first volunteer fire company in America in 1736. Called it the Union Fire Company. 30 men, buckets, determination. It wasn't enough to stop every fire. But it was something. It was always something with Franklin. By the mid-1700s, Philadelphia had grown from a forest into a city of over 15,000 people. Streets that were mud in 1700 were now cobblestone, each stone placed by hand, fitted tightly against its neighbor, locked in place by its own weight and the weight of everything around it. The cobblestones came from the riverbed and from quarries outside the city. They were transported by horse and wagon, unloaded by hand, and set into a bed of compacted sand by workers on their knees. The work was slow, painful, permanent. Those same cobblestones still exist in parts of Philadelphia today. You can walk on them. You can feel them through your shoes. Uneven, ancient, real. Every single one of them was placed by a human being who is now gone. And rising above all of it, above the cobblestones and the brick houses and the chimneys and the market stalls, was Independence Hall. It took 21 years to build, not because the workers were slow, because perfection takes time. And the people of Philadelphia, even the ones who would never be allowed inside, seemed to understand that what was being built on Chestnut Street was something that mattered, something that needed to be done right. So they did it right. Brick by brick, beam by beam, peg by peg. And when it was finally finished, when the tower was complete and the bell was hung and the windows were glazed and the floors were polished, it looked exactly like what it was. A building built to hold something larger than itself. The city that William Penn drew on paper in 1682 had become real, not because of one man, not because of the founding fathers whose portraits hang in museums, but because of thousands of ordinary people who woke up every morning, picked up their tools, and built something that would outlast them by centuries. They didn't know that. They were just trying to finish before dark. And that, more than any speech, more than any painting, more than any document signed in a room full of important men, is the real story of Philadelphia. It is a story written in brick and mortar and wood and glass and sweat, and it is still standing. Go see it for yourself.